So it's been raining quite a bit here in Northern California. So this is a RockShox Super Deluxe Coil. So this is exactly the same option that comes as optional equipment on the Mega Tower. So I got this from somebody on Pink Bike. So they were looking to unload it. So far, just putting around. I could already tell the small bump is much improved on the Coil, but it just feels like you have about like 4 or 5 less PSI in the tires. It's the best way I can describe it. So far, I'm noticing pedals pretty well. And that's probably so far the most unexpected thing is how well it climbs still. You know, it just kind of goes to show that a lot of the bikes these days climb well, not necessarily because of the low speed compression on the shock, but rather how they've placed the pivots on the suspension linkage. I've got the low speed compression pretty much backed out all the way. In fact, I think it's fully backed out, and so far don't really feel the need to add more. I gotta say, it doesn't really pedal any worse than the air shock. The Coil shock is a lot heavier, so there's that. But depending on what you're riding, where you're riding, that may not be a big deal. But it did add like over a pound of weight between the air and the Coil shock. So that is something to consider. I gotta say, I'm pretty impressed with this Maxxis Dissector rear tire that I'm running. I've been running it for, I don't know, 3 months or so. When I had it, it was like super dry and dusty here. I really liked it. I can kind of tell it's not gonna last the longest. Compound is pretty sticky. This is really kind of the first time I'm riding it in the wet, and I like it. Probably not as good as maybe the DHR2 on the wet stuff, the wet rocks, but I'd say maybe on par with the Aggressor. Pretty close to that, I'd say. Coming up here on the last part of the climb, and yeah, like I said, I didn't notice it any worse than the air shock. Probably won't obviously get to go as fast as I normally would. Woo! That's where I broke a derailleur last time. Oh, missed that jump. All right, I gotta take it easy. But yeah, I think my initial impression so far, I was actually a little worried that the Coil might mute the trail a little too much. If you saw my Mega Tower review, you know that I appreciate getting some feedback about what's going on. Oh, it's muddy. And I can happily say that there's still plenty of feedback there. But it does take the edge off the hits way better than the air shock. And so, so far I can say the biggest difference I noticed is that small bump, that first like 1/4 inch of suspension travel. The Coil just soaks that up really, really well. So if small bump is something that you're struggling with on your air shock and you really want to improve that, then I think a Coil shock is definitely your way to go. Surprisingly so far, at least on this first run, way more supportive than I thought. This is a 450-pound spring, which Santa Cruz says is recommended for somebody 170 pounds. So I'm right around that weight. I'm about 168, probably 170 with my gear. So this is kind of the right spring that I need to be on. It didn't feel harsh at all, but it was like very supportive. Like right after that, that initial suppleness, there's plenty of stuff to push off of, which really surprised me. This shock doesn't have a high-speed compression adjustment, so it kind of is what it is, but it does have a low speed. And like I mentioned on the climb up here, it's pretty much fully open. I don't have any low-speed compression, and it still pedals really well. So far, yeah, really not a whole lot of downside so far, besides for maybe the additional weight. I would say the differences between this and the Air is not dramatic. It's not 2 times better, but it is an improvement for specific characteristics that you may be looking for. Specifically on those chattery sections, high-speed chattery sections where you want to glide over the top of some of those bumps. I think that's where you're going to notice the biggest difference on the Coil. I really thought it would kind of just like be really mushy through the mid-stroke, but maybe this has something to do with the added progressivity of the newer suspensions, but there was plenty for me to push off of. Like, I didn't notice that much of a downside with an equivalent air shock. So yeah, initial impressions are really good. The bike is still super poppy, which is again kind of the biggest thing that surprised me. Man, it's been a while since I rode this trail. Yep, lots of debris. Yeah. Take it easy here. It's probably worse that I'm going slower, actually. It's funny how that works. Yeah, probably going about as half as I normally do on that trail, but I can already tell much less feedback. So I gotta imagine that the designers of this bike designed this bike around the Coil, and then adapted the air shock after. So I think Santa Cruz nailed the tune on this Coil shock. I don't feel like I need really to change anything. In fact, I haven't touched any of the dials since I've gotten here. Yeah, there's really, besides for the additional weight, there's really no downsides, surprisingly, with this Coil shock. I think I'll keep it on here for a few months, report back on how it's holding up. I may go back to the air shock. I may do a video where I swap back and forth on the same day, just to do a back-to-back comparison. But yeah, so far so good. I'm liking it. It's staying on there for a while. Oh yeah, much needed. It's time to get some lunch, head back to work. It's been a while, guys. Good to see you. Remember, those trails don't get easier, you get better. Go out and get some.